Virginia. I am Subasati. I'm talking from Fairfax Station, Virginia. I'm an ARP community ambassador, volunteer with ARP Virginia. ARP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that empowers people to choose how they live as they age. We're here to make your voice heard and provide information and resources on the issues that matter and to connect you with fun learning opportunities. We provide valuable educational, informational, and fun resources, things like webinars, teletown halls, discounts, and more. When it's safe to host in-person events, you'll be invited to attend. In the meantime, ARP will continue to offer programs virtually. Studies have shown that challenging your brain in ways throughout life may strengthen your brain. Our brain is stimulated and makes new connections when we learn new things or pursue new interests. AARP encourages you to stay curious and give yourself a good mental workout by doing something that challenges your thinking, offers you enjoyment, and encourages you to grapple with new and complex ideas. While this program may not be sufficiently rigorous to be defined as a cognitively stimulating activity, it's important to note that it's never too late to seek out a new activity that challenges the way you think. So we applaud and thank you for joining us today. So before we get started on today's program, I have a few housekeeping items to review with you. We may have time for Q&A at the end of today's presentation, so please submit your comments and questions in the chat box. If you're trying to multitask or move around, please turn your camera off and please put yourself on mute. Now, on to our program. It is indeed my pleasure today to introduce and welcome our guest speaker, Christian Godart. Christian Godart has loved aviation his whole life. He first flew at the age of 17 years old and decided to pursue an aviation degree following high school. After college, life took him in another direction, but he always maintained his love of everything airplanes and aviation in general. He's retired from Fairfax County Public Schools, where he worked as a technology specialist for over 20 years. Christian enjoys passing on his love of aviation to others by volunteering at the National Air and Space Museum Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia. And he's also a National Park volunteer at the Wright Brothers National Memorial Park in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So today we're in for a real treat as Chris tells us about the early stages of the Wright family and how Wilbur and Orville got interested in flight, why they went to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, and their 1900, 1901, 1902 tests in Kitty Hawk. So please give a warm virtual welcome to Christian. And Christian, the screen is yours.
All right, well, thank you very much. Just want to make sure, can everybody hear me? And can you see my presentation? Yes?
Yes.
All right, good. Well, you know, yeah, I love the Wright brothers story. I love sharing the Wright brothers story. I hope someday somebody will make like a real movie out of this, not just a documentary of some sort, but some Tom Hanks thing or something. You know, it's an amazing story, and it really is. So, but to simply say that the Wright brothers invented the airplane, you know, it doesn't really begin to describe the story. I mean, people had seen the ground from a bird's eye view before with balloons, with gliders, and you know, anything else that would give them a little bit of altitude. But the one thing that everybody was talking about trying to do is to solve the problem of aviation, as they put it. And the problem of aviation, the problem of flight, was really level takeoff, control, and level landing, both on the same ground. So today we're going to take you on that journey, a piece of the journey. We'll finish the next one next time. And I promise I'll be on time next time. I won't mess that up twice. But anyway, to really tell their story, we've got to really start with the family. Come on. Here we go. This is Milton. Milton is the dad. He's born in 1828 in Rush County in Indiana. Trying to do this multiple screen here. I'm not, here we go. He's born in Indiana. The main thing about him is he realizes that religion is going to play a big life in his life, a big role in his life, very early on. And he joins the United Brethren of Christ Church. He holds a few positions, and he rises in the ranks of the church, eventually makes to a bishop. And when he's given the rank of bishop, one of his duties is to be editor-in-chief of the church's newspaper, the Religious Telescope. The important thing here is the newspaper is printed in Dayton, Ohio, which is how we end up with the family there. They had lived in Ohio and Dayton before. They owned a house there. But, you know, since he's got a big territory, they moved around a lot. But now they're moving back to Dayton because of the newspaper. He died in 1917. Mom is Susan Kerner. Susan is born in 1881 in Loudoun County, Virginia. Just after she was born, her father moved to Indiana, and originally she's a Presbyterian, but she converted to the United Brethren of Christ Church, and she went to a United school, and that's where she met Milton. They were married in 1859. There's an interesting story there about how when they were married, there was actually a 2.5-year gap between he proposed to her and the time they were married, because right after he proposed to her, he was assigned to do missionary work in Oregon. And he said, you know, would you come to Oregon with me? We'll get married. Susan said, no, I'm not going to Oregon. When you come back, we'll get married. So 2.5 years later, he's back. And within 2 weeks of him coming back, they actually are married. The oldest brother is Rushlin. Rushlin is born in 1861 in Indiana. After graduating from high school, he goes to college. Another United Brethren school, but he left college after 2 years, married a young lady named Lulu. They had 4 children. Only 3 of the children survived to adulthood. But financially, he had a hard time, especially when his in-laws moved in with him. But he had a hard time and couldn't find a lot of work. So he left. He left, and he eventually settled in Kansas and called for the family to come join him. He found work as a bookkeeper in Kansas City. And after a few years doing that, he eventually bought an 80-acre farm in Kansas, raised cattle, grew seed corn. They kept in touch with the family and, you know, through letters and things like that. But by and large, they're detached from the Wilbur and Orville story at that moment. Lauren is brother number 2. And Lauren is born in 1862. He also left Ohio to look for work, couldn't find work in Dayton. Eventually, also in Kansas, found work as a bookkeeper, but he was down by the Oklahoma border. Got homesick, came back to Dayton, found work as a bookkeeper for a carpet store in Dayton. Married Ivanette Miller in 1892. They had 4 children. In 1883, he went to work for Orville and Wilbur in their print shop. And when the brother would come down to North Carolina and Kitty Hawk, he helped younger sister Catherine to manage the bicycle shop while they were working on the gliders. Keep in mind also in that time, Dayton, Ohio was only half paved. Half of the city was still unpaved. So Lawrence started his own street sprinkling company, eventually became a Dayton commissioner for the city of Dayton. And then we've got Wilbur. Wilbur's born April 16th, right? A happy birthday to Wilbur here in a couple of days. In Millville, Indiana, 1867. He's considered an excellent athlete and a student. He completed the requirements for high school when he was in Indiana, but Dad moved to Dayton in May of that year, a month before Wilbur was to get his high school degree. So a lot of people would say, oh, Wilbur and Orville are high school dropouts. Well, not really. I mean, Wilbur did complete high school. He's just a month short from getting his certificate itself. After the move to Dayton, he took some college prep courses and he planned to attend Yale University. Unfortunately for him, maybe fortunately for history, he never attended Yale. His future took a real sharp turn in the winter of 85, 86. He was playing some kind of ice hockey game, shinny ice hockey game on ice, and he was smashed in the face with a stick. We don't know if it was intentional or an accident, but most of his upper teeth were knocked out. And for weeks afterward, Wilbur had tremendous pain in his face. And that really also contributed to digestive complications and heart palpitations. He became depressed and he really withdrew from the world. He dropped his plans to attend Yale. And right about this time is also when Mom is getting really sick. So Wilbur decides to stay home and devote himself to nursing his mom until she died in 1889. We'll talk about Wilbur again a little bit more in detail in a little bit. We've got, right after Wilbur, a set of twins being born, Otis and Ida. They died in infancy. Ida died at birth. Otis died a month later. And then comes Orville. Orville is born August 19 in 1871 in Dayton, Ohio. He's not as studious as a brother, as Wilbur. He's actually considered quite mischievous and was expelled for a couple of days from elementary school for some of his activities. He is, however, a great tinkerer. He loves making things and taking things apart and seeing how they work and all of that. He enrolled at Central High School, but he never graduated. He dropped out after 11th grade. He really wanted to start a business as a printer. He wanted to own a print shop and start his business as a printer. There's a whole story with that. We can get into that a little bit if you want. And then we have the younger sister, Catherine. Catherine is born August 19th, same date as Orville, but 3 years later in 1874. Now, you have to think back, think of the times in which we're talking about 1870s now. At 15, when it's 1889, when Mom died, Catherine, being the only girl in the family, even though she's only 15 years old at the time, she really takes her place as the head of the Wright household. You can see in all the letters when Dad is on the road, anything to do with the house or the finances or any of that, he directs to Catherine, not to the boys, even though they're older. Everything to do with the household and everything else is dealt with Catherine. She attended Oberlin College in 1896, and actually the only one of the Wright siblings to finish college. She taught classical literature and Latin at Steele High School in Dayton. Along with Lauren, she looked after the bicycle business while they were in Kitty Hawk. And there's a lot of correspondence between Catherine and the two brothers. The three of them were very close. Lauren, Wilbur, and Orville, they were very close. It's said that they seemed bound by an unspoken agreement never to marry and really remain there for each other the whole time. When Orville was badly injured during the flight demonstration in 1908, this is when he's trying to demonstrate to the US Army Signal Corps the benefits of the airplane. He crashed the plane. Well, a piece of the propeller broke off. The plane hit the ground and he broke his femur. He was badly injured. He was in the hospital in Washington, D.C. She, Catherine, took emergency leave from her teaching spot and she went down, nursed Orville back to health. She never returned to school. Instead, she went with Wilbur to France afterwards. It's kind of interesting because while Orville is trying to sell the airplane to the US government, Wilbur is in France trying to get contracts for the plane. And the social life in France was such that Wilbur just became overwhelmed with all this, and he didn't really want to do a lot of that stuff. So he wrote to Catherine. He asked her to take care of it. It's interesting that, Wilbur spent quite a few months in France, never really learned French, but Catherine was the darling of the French society. She learned how to speak French. In the 1920s, she renewed a correspondence with an old friend from her college days, a gentleman named Henry Haskell. He was a widower who lived in Kansas City. And they began a romance through the letters and all of that. And during one of his visits, she accepted his offer of marriage. Remember how I said the three of them had kind of this unwritten bond with each other? Well, she actually was afraid of what Orville's reaction would be. She asked Henry to break the news to Orville. Orville was devastated. He stopped speaking to her, would not speak to Catherine, wouldn't have anything to do with Catherine. Lauren tried to intervene, but Orville would have none of it. Catherine was married in November 1928. Orville refused to attend. Catherine and her husband moved to Kansas City, but she was really upset about the broken relationship with Orville. She tried many times to reconcile with him, but always Orville refused. 2 years after her marriage, short marriage, Catherine contracted pneumonia. And it's one of those things where, if you had it pretty bad, they could diagnose it, but they really couldn't treat it for you. When Orville found out, he was upset, but he still refused to contact her. Lauren is the one who persuaded Orville to go see Catherine, and he was actually at her bedside when she died. She died at 54 years old. This is their house in Dayton, Ohio, on Hawthorne Street. Now, their interests, Orville and Wilbur's interests, during one of his travels, Milton, in 1878, brought home a toy helicopter for the boys. He usually always brought back something from his trips, but it was always educational. This little helicopter thing had quite an impact on the boys. Basically, you rotate it. I don't know if you could see it very well. It's got a rubber band, and you rotate the propeller until it winds up. Then you let it go, and it just flies up in the air. It had an impact on the boys when it came to how things flew. And they made copies of this. They broke it, but they made copies of it for themselves, and they were really interested in how it worked. Now, when we left Orville and Wilbur, we were in the late 1880s. Wilbur is caring for his mom, and Orville had just left high school. And Orville enjoyed going to the press room of the dad's press shop. He took up printing as a serious hobby. And in 1888, with Wilbur's assistance, he built a larger, more professional press so he could accept printing jobs. It marks the first time in history that their signature, the Wright brothers, appear in print. They worked on several publications and short-lived local newspapers, including things like The Midget, which was a small school newspaper, the church pamphlets, bicycle parts catalog. This is one of their newspapers, the West Side News. The Wrights maintained their printing business until 1899. They sold it after Ed Sines, who had been doing most of the day-to-day work, left the business. Now, the bicycle craze in America began in 1887 with the introduction from England of the safety bicycle. Well, you could see why they called it the safety bicycle. I mean, the earlier one is the thing that you basically take your life in your own hands to get on and off of that thing. But now we've got a bicycle that looks a lot more like the bicycles we're familiar with. and they called that the safety bicycles. Both brothers purchased bicycles in the spring of '92. Wilbur would go on long country rides. Orville enjoyed racing it and considered himself a scorcher with his bicycle on the track. The brothers had a reputation as skillful cyclists. And remember, they like to tinker with things, they like to mess with things, and they, whenever something went wrong with the bicycle, they fixed it themselves. And of course, now that leads to quite a few requests from their friends to fix their bicycles. Well, ta-da, we've got a business in the making. In 1893, they capitalized on it and opened a small rental and repair shop. The name of the shop is the Wright Cycle Company. With Ed Sines handling most of the day stuff in the printing shop, the brothers were in search of a new challenge, and the bicycles furnished it. They quickly expanded their enterprise from rental and repair to a sales shop carrying a lot of different brands. But again, with stiff competition, they decided to manufacture their own line. They introduced their first models the following year. This is the Van Cleve, which is named after someone in Mom's family. It was the top of the line. The St. Clair was a little bit less expensive. This is the Wright Cycle Company. They would change buildings as the business grew. There's Wilbur working in it. The spark, what really got them to work and think about aviation? Well, during this time, there's a gentleman, a man named Otto Lilienthal in Prussia, now Germany. And he's studying and demonstrating non-powered glider flights. Scientific, popular newspapers, including newspapers in Dayton, would publish accounts of his exploits and sometimes photographs of the gliders. The brothers, like many others at the time, took interest in this and thought it was really cool to follow these exploits of this Lilienthal person. They read all the stories they could related to this man. In 1896, Orville comes down with typhoid fever. It's a potentially deadly disease in those days. Your body basically had to fight it off on its own. He was bedridden for 6 weeks, teetering between life and death. During that time, Catherine and Wilbur kept company to their brothers and read to him every day, books, newspapers. And one day while they were reading a newspaper, Wilbur comes along with an obituary for Otto Lilienthal. Otto died in August when his glider, that's his glider, fell and crashed from about 50 feet. He broke his neck and he died the next day. This is him, also a picture of him doing his glider. One thing I want you to look at when he's doing it is how he's doing his glides. He's basically hanging on to the glider, right? There were others during that period that were making news in regard to flight. Orville eventually recovered, but we've got Samuel Langley. Samuel Langley is the director of the Smithsonian. He's the third director of the Smithsonian. He's an astronomer by trade, but he's very much interested in flight. And he's making news with regards to flight. In May 1896, he flew the Aerodrome number 5, which is a steam-powered glider over half a mile on the Potomac. His glider remained aloft for a minute and a half. With that caught the eye of the government quite a bit, and they gave him a grant to develop that glider into something that could carry a man. We'll talk about that a little bit again later as we get into airplane design. Another gentleman that's interesting in flight is Octave Chanut. He lives in Indiana. He's also working on glider designs. He even published a series of articles called The Progress in Flying Machines. This is one of his designs. But the design that showed best was this one, a biplane. That's Mr. Herring. They're hanging on to it. And again, it's the same thing as Otto, right? They're just hanging on, feet are dangling freely. The brothers really got curious about what had caused the crash of Lilienthal. That spark of interest kept flickering through reading as much as they could, especially Wilbur. Wilbur wrote a letter to the Smithsonian. This is the letter. And we're not going to read the whole thing, but basically he says, I've been interested in the problem of mechanical and human flight ever since as a boy. My observations have only convinced me that human flight is possible and practicable. It's only a question of knowledge and skill. Birds are the most perfectly trained gymnasts in the world, and they're especially well fitted for their work. And it may be that man will never equal them, but he is convinced that the effort required in ordinary flight is possible. He goes on to explain, I'm not a crank. I do have an interest in this, and I have theories as to the proper construction of a flying machine. I wish to avail myself of all that is already known, and if possible, add my might to help on the future worker who will attain final success. And he wants to know, what have you got? How much would it cost? Let me know. I'll be glad to pay you, that kind of thing. But it really shows here that, he doesn't say, I want to invent an airplane. He's interested in the problem of flight, much like these others. He's asking for whatever information they already have and proposes that he will add his own information to that if he comes across to get any of that information. What's interesting here also is not just the letter, but more importantly, the tone of the letter. Deserves a second look how the brothers got into the study. Wilbur wrote the letter in the first person, never mentioning Orville. Later, he claimed that when he wrote I, he really meant to say we. But we also know that Milton, Dad, always believed that Wilbur had drawn Orville into the flying machine issue. Orville, must admit, never wanted to remain behind if there's work to be done on the project that really interests him. And once Orville fully committed himself to the flying machine experiments, the two brothers make an effort to represent a joint corporate personality to the world. There's a fair amount of work already done on lift by others, but very little on control. So they decide to focus their attention on the control aspect. Wilbur is convinced that, if you're just hanging on or barely grabbing the glider, gusts of wind is going to throw you off course and you'll have no control whatsoever. And excuse me, this is what's causing the wrecks and what caused Otto Lilienthal to crash his glider and die. So he wants to really work on controlling this flying object, this flying glider. And Wilbur starts a correspondence with Octave Chanut because he got Chanut's pamphlet. And he tells him, he had seen a pigeon change direction very quickly in a short amount of time. And he's convinced that this is not done by weight shifting alone. You can't just shift your weight, which is what people who had been doing the glides were doing. He and Orville made many trips to watch the birds outside of Dayton, particularly the big birds, the huge birds, the buzzards. They made two important observations. First, that when the birds turned in the air, they rolled their bodies right to left or left to right. Second, they somehow adjusted the primary feathers, the tip of the wing, to initiate that roll. This is a quote. The thought came to me that possibly the birds adjusted the tips of their wings so as to present one tip at a positive angle, the other at a negative angle, turning itself into an animated windmill. they kind of got that, didn't they? How the bird does it. But now comes the problem of how you can do the same thing with a man-made object. The solution came to him one afternoon in the bicycle shop. He's just installed a new tire on the customer's bicycle. And he's now holding the empty box, and here's what the box looked like. Keep in mind, this is a reproduction of that box. But he's holding the box in his hands, and he's at the register talking to gentlemen, just chatting away. And while he's chatting, how's the weather? He's fiddling with the box. And as he's fiddling with the box, he twists it in his hands. And you could see in the picture, he realizes that, look, when you pinch two sides together, it raises one corner, lowers the other. And if you switch it, it raises the opposite corner and lowers the other. And, this is a moment, I personally, my opinion, it's an inventor's moment. Because if it was me, I'd probably put the box down, say $3.95, thank you very much, have a good day. But his graphic imagination, the inventor in Wilbur, the path from seeing something in his hands to finding a solution to the problem he'd been thinking about is really what sets him apart. And twisting, that was the answer. After Wilbur explained the principle that evening, they soon began building a kite with the principle of twisting here that he discovered in a paper box. We don't have a picture of that kite. We have the drawings. And this is a picture of a replica. And it shows the way Wilbur intended to control the kite. You can see how he's pulling on the handles, and that's what would make the twisting of the wing, and it worked. The kite responded and precisely, and it proved the soundness of what would become the wing warping system. By August 1899, the brothers are now ready to move on to design a glider with that control system. They looked at it as three major engineering tasks. First, the wings had to generate enough lift to support the weight of the glider and a pilot. Second, the wings had to be flexible so they could be twisted. And third, the pilot had to have some type of control system to move the control surfaces. There was data involving the study of lift, but it's not easy to differentiate between accurate data used on maybe faulty experiments. Wilbur settled on a formula. He began solving it by inserting this known data. This is the Lilienthal table. I'm not showing this to you so you can look at that formula and solve any work. I just want to say, this is not the work of some high school dropouts. Using these formulas, he came up with an area for the wing of his new glider, 165 square feet, and a biplane, approximately 17 by 5 feet. For wing flexibility, they decided to brace the machine, but only brace the cord in the middle. This would allow them to twist the tip of the wings. They ran cables from the wingtips to a kick bar operated by their feet. At first, Wilbur thought they could test the glider. This is the glider in the nearby fields around Dayton. But they quickly realized they did not have the wind velocity necessary to sustain the glider. He needed at least 12 to 15 miles an hour wind every day. Wilbur wrote Octave Chanut for advice. Chanut quickly replied. He said, "You're going to need something with a sand hill for learning how to do this, and maybe over water." He mentioned San Diego, or Fort Myers, Florida, but no, that didn't really work. That's too busy. And, given the distances, Wilbur kind of refuses to guess as to where is going to be the best site for them to do the testing. So he writes a letter to the US Weather Bureau. And the weather, he wants to know what are the windiest places in the United States. He gets a pamphlet back from the Weather Bureau that they had published. And sure enough, there's 100 places, top places, windy places in the United States. And I know you can't talk back to me now, but think about this for a second. What is the windiest places in the United States? And those of you that said the Windy City are correct. Chicago was #1 on the list. But they ruled out Chicago. Too busy, too many people, and they kind of don't want that. And then #2, #3, 4, 5, all the places were all ruled out. Again, it's too far away, too busy, too many people, the sand dunes, but too rocky. And they get to #6 on the list. And #6 on the list of windy places in the United States is somewhere called Kitty Hawk in North Carolina. Great. If you live in Dayton now, where on earth is Kitty Hawk, North Carolina? They've never heard of the place. So off to the library, we look at the map and realize, oh, it's on the eastern shore of North Carolina. That could be doable. But again, wanting to make sure, Wilbur sends a letter to the weather office in Kitty Hawk. And here's where it gets really interesting. He gets a letter back from the weather office in Kitty Hawk that says, yes, we've got the winds here, the prevailing winds out of the north, and soft ground and everything you're looking for. But most importantly, the guy at the Weather Bureau showed Wilbur's letter to a gentleman named Bill Tate, William Tate. Now, Bill Tate is the go-to guy in Kitty Hawk. He's not the mayor. There's no mayor, but he's the head of the life station. He runs the post office, and he's the go-to person for Kitty Hawk, which is why he gets that copy of the letter. And he decides to write his own letter back to Wilbur. And he says, we would love to, if you came down here to do your flying experiments. We have consistent winds out of the north. We have a beach that's 1 mile wide and 5 miles long. And there's basically nobody here. And, basically he says the last sentence, if you choose to come to Kitty Hawk, we will strive to make your stay as pleasurable as possible. How can you refuse? Kitty Hawk it would be. So by early August, Wilbur and Orville had cut, steamed, and bent the ash ribs that would give shape to the wings. Anything not available locally, like the steel wire and things like that, they were ordered. Other components were built separately. The only thing missing is the long pieces of spruce that are going to make the wing spars. He decided to take a chance and figured on his way to Kitty Hawk, they will stop at Norfolk, which is the largest city on the way there, and it's a port city, and we'll be able to find the length of the wing spars of spruce that we need. Other than the trip to Chicago in 1893, Wilbur had never ventured further than a bicycle ride from Dayton. But on September 6, 1900, he boarded a train and traveled through the night, arriving the following evening at Old Point Comfort in Virginia. Basically what they did is they took a train. Wilbur left first. He took a train from Dayton to Cincinnati. In Cincinnati, an overnight train that would go through Richmond on the way to Norfolk. And in Norfolk now, he is going to look for his wing spars. He spent the entire day searching, but he had no luck finding the length he needed. The only thing he could find in length is 16 feet, 2 feet shorter. So he bought the 16-foot spars, but now instead of looking for 12 to 15 mile an hour wind, he's going to have to look for 15 to 18 mile an hour wind. And then from Norfolk, he's going to take a steamer, the Pennsylvania steamer. across the mouth of the James. And from there, he's going to catch a train again to Elizabeth City. Now, in Elizabeth City, there's a boat that will go to Kitty Hawk, but it's only a weekly boat. It only leaves on Wednesday. And of course, Wilbur gets there like on a Thursday or a Friday. So he's looking. It takes him a while to find 2-3 days before he comes across a skipper of a schooner, a guy named Israel Perry, to agree to take him to Kitty Hawk. The schooner is a Sharpie named the Curlicue. It's kind of dilapidated, and Wilbur had no choice. This is a picture of a schooner. It's not the Curlicue, but it's very much like the Curlicue. It's a flat bottom boat. It's an example of the boat. He and the skipper, getting myself ahead of myself. He and the skipper's son left Elizabeth City on the afternoon of the 11th. First part of the trip is fairly normal. They took the Pasquotank River down to the Sound, but once they got on the Sound, the winds started to come up and waves began to build up. And unfortunately, the weather forecast being what it is in 1900, unbeknownst to Wilbur and Mr. Perry, the skipper, they had gotten hit by the tail end of a hurricane. So the boat is really having a hard time. The sails get ripped, torn loose. Wilbur and Israel's son are having to bail the water out. Eventually, they make their way to an inlet using only the jib of the boat, using an inlet, but they're safe. They spent the night there, and then they spent the whole next day also to repair the sails. Wilbur finally made it to Kitty Hawk late on the 12th. Took him 7 days to go from Dayton to Kitty Hawk. And he makes his way to the Tate's house, knocks on the door. Mr. Tate's very surprised to see this fine gentleman dressed, like gentlemen would be in those days, outside his door. And Wilbur says, "Oh, I'm Wilbur Wright. I'm the guy who wrote to you. And you offered me to come, so here I am, It didn't take long for Mrs. Tate to realize that Wilbur had not eaten in a couple of days, and she gave him a pretty hearty breakfast and very kindly moved the daughter into their bedroom and offered Wilbur the daughter's bedroom until he could put up and find his own accommodations. This is the Tate family. There's Mr. Tate outside the post office. Wilbur set to assemble the glider the next day. He borrows Mrs. Tate's sewing machine to, work on covering the wing coverings to accommodate the shorter spars. He's gonna modify them. The glider's almost complete. Orville arrives on the 28th. They stay with the States a couple more days until they set up their tent in the field about half a mile south from there. This is the field next to the Tates, the area where they set up the tent. Right there is where the tent is. And there's Wilbur. You can see the wing spars leaning against the tent. Wilbur washing pots and pans. About that time is when they begin the flying tests of the glider. The first tests don't go well at all. Wilbur climbs aboard the kite while Mr. Tate and Orville are holding on to it, and they fly with a rope attached. But the kite really starts to move erratically and out of control. Once they realized what was happening and how dangerous it was, they reeled him in quickly, and all the future tests were limited to testing the glider as an unmanned kite. But they learned to control the craft. They measured the lift, the drag, using things like a spring scale, an inclinometer. They flew it with lengths of chains wrapped around the bar between the wings to simulate the weight of a pilot. They believed the numbers they calculated would have to match Lilienthal's stable. but they found that the glider produced much less lift than what the table said. So the question they had now, were we wrong, or is Lilienthal's table incorrect? During this period, while making adjustments to the kite, a gust of wind blew it and snatched the glider about 20 feet off the ground. It took them 3 days to repair it. Now, sometime in late October, when the wind was blowing pretty good, they took the glider to the area known as Kill Devil Hills. It's an area where there are 3 big sand dunes, Kill Devil Hill area, the Kill Devil Hills. The Wrights immediately recognized that area and that environment is better suited for gliding than anywhere else on the island. Wilbur does all the flying. He still considered these experiments to be primarily his personal undertakings. Even though Orville is starting to shoulder an increasing share of the build and the burden, Wilbur, and remember, Dad believes that this is Wilbur's idea, and Orville is kind of tagging along. Wilbur is afraid that if something happens to Orville, his dad would blame him if something happened to the younger boy. The glides they made were unspectacular, but they're anything as good as Herring had been doing, and anything Chanut had accomplished with his glider. But most importantly, it gives Wilbur a taste of flight. They left Kitty Hawk on October 23rd and arrived back at Dayton a few days later. Before Will and Orville left, they took their gliders out in the sandhill from like one last ceremonial flight. They tossed the craft without any tethers or anybody in it, and they crashed it. After they left, Mrs. Tate went out there, recovered the fabric, and sewed dresses for their daughters. Now, looking back at the data that they got, the 1900 glider produced only about half the lift that the Wrights thought they were going to get. For all their careful planning, something is obviously very wrong. Still, they're pleased with their visit to Kitty Hawk. Testing has validated quite a lot of their design concept, in particular, the control method. They had enjoyed their stay at the little fishing village, and so far they've only spent $15 to build the glider. Shortly after arriving back in Dayton, Wilbur wrote to Octave Chanut, giving him a report of what he and the brother had accomplished. Chanut is thoroughly impressed, not just with the flights, but with the construction. And, he's very impressed with what this young man had done. The brother decided they're going to return in Kitty Hawk in 1901 with a new machine. And they're going to make improvements based on the lesson they learned. They're going to plan on staying longer. They're going to build a permanent camp, complete with a hangar to work on the glider. They're planning to go 6 to 8 weeks. Now, Amber, is this a good stopping point for you guys?
Hey, Chris, this is Suba.
Yeah.
We got you going, if you wanted to, till 2:45 since we started late.
Okay, so I'm good for another 10.
Yeah, about 10 minutes or so.
10 minutes?
Yeah, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, we'll stop right before they get to 1902 Kitty Hawk.
All right.
Okay. The design of their machine is almost complete by mid-May 1901. And this time, remember, they're a little disappointed with the amount of lift that they got on that first glider. By the way, I meant to tell you, so look at that picture. You can see the ocean in the background. Kind of a cool. And one of the things that the brothers did was unparalleled to anyone else working on this problem of flight, is they documented everything. Everything they tried and they did, they wrote it down. They took thousands of pictures of everything they did. It's just absolutely amazing. But anyway, now they're looking at trying to do something for 1901. And they're not going to take any chances with the lift. The spars, remember, they were looking for 18 feet. They got 16. Well, now they're going to make him 22 feet. And the cord 7. They will find the spars. They ordered the spars somewhere, but they got him at 22 feet. This would make their 1901 glider the largest glider ever flown up to that time, with a total surface of 315 square feet, including the elevator. They also removed one uncertainty, the camber, or if you talk about the design of a wing, the thickness and the curve of the wing would be 1:12 instead of the 1:23 they had used the year before. Now, in early summer, the Wrights had a bit of an unexpected luck. A gentleman named Charlie Taylor. Charlie Taylor is a good friend. He's a fellow bicycle mechanic. He works, he's got his own shop, but he's the one that welds the frames of the bicycles that he sells to the brothers, on which they make their bicycle. They don't do their own welding. He does it for them. But Charlie, he had his own tool business and all of that stuff. He sold that business and he used that money to buy a house. Now he's working for the Dayton Electric Company. Keep in mind, the Wright business, the bicycle business, is a seasonal business. I mean, in summertime is when people ride their bicycles. So usually, like in 1900, they had to wait until the fall when the bicycle business slowed down to leave and go to Kitty Hawk. And they left it in the hands. It was enough to do it with Catherine and Lauren because there's really not that much going on. But Charlie knows the bicycle business, and they offer him a job. They said, we will give you $16.50 a week, which is better than what he's making at the electric company. And Charlie came to work for the Wrights that next Monday. I often point to this moment as another turning point. We talked about when Wilbur got injured. When you hire somebody to look after your business, the one that's making you money, it shows that this flying thing becomes a little bit more than just a hobby at that point. Maybe it's still a hobby, but it's consuming them a little bit, enough that they're willing to pay someone to run the shop so they can take off and go to Kitty Hawk. On June 19, Wilbur wrote again to Octave Chanut. This is a picture of Octave Chanut. And this is his quote: "Owing to the changes in our business arrangement, we shall start our trip much earlier than we anticipated." Chanut proposed sending 2 guys with him, 2 men to meet him in Kitty Hawk. One is his own builder, Edward Huffaker, and the other is a physician, doctor who fancies himself an engineer named George Pratt. Wilbur quickly replied to the says, "We don't need any help, but we'll be thankful for the company." So they agreed that Huffaker, Pratt, and Chanut himself could visit the brothers in Kitty Hawk in 1901. Chanut loaned them his top-of-the-line anemometer. It's a machine that it's a gizmo that measures a wind speed, an inclinometer. They left for North Carolina on July 7, 1901. And this time, well, there's not a lot of luck with the weather. They left and they went together, but they were grounded when they got to Elizabeth City. Another hurricane had come through, and it took them 3 days until they could get back on. The anemometer that they went outside, it registered 93-mile-an-hour winds. So anyway, they had to wait until the storm had passed to keep going on their trip. So I'm going to stop there because this is a good spot. Now we can talk about the hangar they're going to build and the visits and their everything they're going to do in 1901. So, what is Kitty Hawk like at the time? Well, let's just say there's no Wright Memorial Bridge. If anybody's been to the Outer Banks, there's no bridge to get there. You can only get there by boat. There's few hundred people. Orville, in one of his letters to Catherine, described it as it's a place with a few one-story homes, and mostly fishermen live there. They're not quite sure what to make of these two guys who are dressed like gentlemen, but yet are sleeping in the tent and working on the flying machine, So getting to Kitty Hawk and the people of Kitty Hawk is quite an interesting story as well. Orville also described something along the lines that the animals here are the sorriest animals he's ever seen. The cows and the horses are super skinny. Obviously, there's very little vegetation for them to feed on. But he says the only thing that really does very well in these parts are the mosquitoes, he says. So I'll stop there. So any questions? I'd love to answer questions. Keep in mind, we've got the big chunk of the flying left to go, but anything so far, be glad to answer it.
Yep. So Christian, we got our first question. What made you interested in the brothers?
Me personally? Well,
yes.
Working at the Smithsonian, you're interested in flight, and they're the ones who started it all. And we've got the original Wright flyer there. And I started, and I'm sure everyone can appreciate what I'm going to say here. You start by opening a book, and then you read that book, and you say, well, gee, I wonder why. And then you're reading more about it. Then you read a little bit more. And next thing you know, you're asking questions. Fortunate enough, I had the time to spend with Tom Crouch, who's the curator. He's a curator emeritus. He retired a year ago, but he was the curator for the Wright brothers display and everything else, Wright brothers, with the Smithsonian. The Wright family always have a spokesperson, that one of the members of the family that would speak for the family. And until recently, until she passed away, Ivanette Miller, Lauren's daughter, was the spokesperson. And Tom Crouch was friends with Ivanette. He had a tremendous amount of information. And I was fortunate enough to be able to pick his brain on a lot of questions I had.
Okay. Next question, Chris, is where are their extensive records archived?
There are two places. Anything to do with the flight, and all the records and the pictures to do with the flight are at the National Archives. Anything to do with the family and the personal side of the story are at Wright State University in Ohio.
Thank you. So Kay, I'm going to let you know about future sessions. Actually, Chris will be on with us again, and I'm going to talk about that in my closing comments. Trudy, do you have other questions?
I do have one question, Suba. Did you interact with the author, David McCullough, during the writing of this book?
No. His book, there's a few books. There are two books. The two most popular books are David McCullough's book. The first one was Tom Crouch's. It's called The Bishop's Boys. And then we were all very excited when David McCullough's book came out to see if he had come up with anything new or anything that was not previously known. And he really had not, by and large. So the information presented in both books is still the same, except Tom's book is a little bit more detailed. David McCullough is a wonderful author, and his story, the book of his story, kind of flows a little bit better, let's say. But no, I had access to Tom, so I didn't need to really get with David.
Suba and Chris, do we have time for one more question?
Yes,
Of course.
go ahead. Go ahead.
So the question is, so did the Wright brothers invent the airplane or did they improve on other inventors?
I'm going to answer that when we finish.
Okay.
After we get them up in the air, after they get up in the air and they do their flights on December 17th, we will talk about the claim that they are first or were others first.
All right, so
Good question.
Bill, you have
But I
to,
think
Bill,
let's
you have
get-
to
let's
stay
get-
tuned for that answer, okay?
Yeah, let's get them up in the air. So far, they haven't done anything except gliders.
Okay. I did have one other question. I think we skipped it, or maybe it was the same, but can you suggest a good book for someone with a flight background and best places to visit to learn more?
Yeah, with a flight background, I would do Tom Crouch's, the Bishop's Boys. There are, yeah, you can also, I would also recommend, if you want to just Google it, really, some of the papers written by the Wrights, the papers on which these authors base themselves, if you really want to know more about the flight. But I think if you are familiar with flight and the forces of flight and everything, I'll cover some of that the next time. As far as places to visit, this is interesting. You've got obviously the Smithsonian downtown as the original flyer, as well as a couple of the gliders and some of the other things that the Wrights owned. Unfortunately, the Smithsonian is closed right now, so you gotta wait a little bit post-COVID and all that until it reopens. And no, I have no idea when it's gonna reopen.
Yeah.
They're talking about reopening some, but us docents would be just like I'm doing now on the big picture screen, interacting with people as they walk through the museum. That's gonna be the first step. But anyway, other places to visit, you've got the Wright brothers National Memorial, which is in Kitty Hawk, and that it is way cool to be there because you are at the exact spot where it happened. And I can tell you from working there, not a day goes by that you don't see some pilot coming in. There's a hard surface runway right next to where the memorial is. It's a 3,500-foot hard surface runway. FFA, First Flight Airport. And anybody with an airplane that can land there, they'll let you stay up to 24 hours for free. So, you know, but I know, you know where Kitty Hawk is located. Every once in a while, you see Navy F-18 fighters fly by over the beach because they have a practice area, a bombing range or something a little bit further south. And then once in a while on the way back, and I could swear this must be some rookie initiation thing or something, because one of them will peel off and we'll do an approach over the runway. Now he can't land, but he'll do a flyby right over the runway and then take off and meet back with his wingman. And that's why I think it's some kind of initiation thing. You got to fly over, you know. We get the Marine Corps Ospreys will come down and they will hover. They'll turn their wings into a hover and face the spot of the flight and then leave. The North Carolina Air Guard, 2 years ago now, when they flew their C-17s for the first time, they wanted to make their first flight to the first flight. So it's a pretty cool place to be there if you want to visit. You can go to Dayton. You can see their shops where they lived and all of that. Unfortunately, not everything is in Dayton. The bicycle shop, the house was bought by Henry Ford and has been moved to Dearborn, Michigan. So Dearborn, Michigan's got nothing to do with the story of the Wright brothers, except they have some of the buildings there in their museum. But anyway.
Thank you, Chris. But anyway, I'll do a little bit of a wrap up here, folks. First of all, thanks for everybody attending on behalf of ARP Virginia. I'd like to thank our guest speaker, again, Christian Godart, for sharing his valuable time and knowledge with us this afternoon. I learned one thing. I always said I thought it was the two brothers. I didn't know they were part of such a big family and had so many brothers and a sister too. So I learned that about them. I didn't know a lot about them because I'm retired Air Force. So we had to do a lot about the Wright brothers. Anyway, we'd love to get your feedback on today's program and ideas for future programs. In the chat box, you'll see a link to a survey. Please click on the link and take a few moments to share your feedback with us. We'll also send this link in a follow-up email later today with this presentation. So we hope to see you in 2 weeks for our next program of Tuesday's Explorers, when Chris will be back on Tuesday, April 27th at 1:30 Eastern Standard Time. We'll continue learning about the Wright brothers. Actually, that's for our people too, because we're having people join us all over the country. So it is Eastern Standard Time. But we'll continue learning about the Wright brothers, hear about their successful first flight in 1903, the years after the patent was granted, the death of the brothers, and some interesting tidbits about the two brothers. Again, in the chat box, you'll see a link to our online calendar, and you can click on it to sign up for this upcoming Tuesday Explorer and many of our other events. So until then, folks, stay curious and keep exploring. Thank you so much for joining us, folks.